Fedor Emelianenko is an MMA god. The heavyweight who went undefeated from 2001 till 2009 has built one of the most impressive records in the sport. But he built that legacy in Japanese fighting promotion Pride. And when he did come to the US, he didn't find the same results as before. So my question is, how good was Fedor Emelianenko actually? Hey guys, it's Kiiyon, and today I want to talk about Fedor Emelianenko, a fighter that many consider to be the greatest of all time. But Fedor's career happened during a time when MMA wasn't in the mainstream, like it is today. And to my surprise, some people don't know who Fedor is. So we're going to take a look at Fedor Emelianenko's career and really decide how good he actually was and what his legacy is on the sport. But first, I want to shout out to SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. SeatGeek is an app that takes the hassle out of buying tickets by rating their seats on a scale of 1 to 10. And they even color grade the seats with green being good and red being bad. And you, my viewers, can get $20 off your first purchase with my code Kiiyon. That's Kiiyon. All the info is going to be in the description down below. Now let's get to the video. Fedor Emelianenko, the Sambo and Judo specialist, began his MMA career in 2000, where he would go 3-0 in Japanese combat sport promotion, rings. He was 22 years old. In his debut against Martin Lazarov, Fedor would land a left Russian hook, also known as a casting hook, that stunned Lazarov. While in the clinch, Fedor attempted to hip toss Martin, but it failed and ended up on the bottom. After a little action on the ground, the ref stood up the fight and Fedor began throwing bombs that had Lazarov in all sorts of trouble. Martin would go for a desperation takedown, and this would cause Fedor to lock in the guillotine choke in the first round. In his second fight with Levon Lagvilava, Fedor won the fight by rear naked choke after having an all-around dominant performance. Fedor threw every strike with bad intentions, and it was even more frightening when he did it rushing towards his opponent. His judo and sambo was effective due to his sheer strength. In his third fight against Hiroya Takada, he didn't even take damage. He threw one combo that immediately put Takada down and ended the fight. In December of that year, Fedor entered the Ring's King of Kings tournament. He fought Ricardo Arona in the first round, and the fight was evenly contested with Fedor looking really strong on the feet. This would cause Ricardo to attempt takedowns, and Fedor would attempt guillotine chokes of his own. When they'd fail and Ricardo got on the top, Fedor was able to shake him off and get on top position. Fedor would continue this in the third round and would take home the unanimous decision. In the second round of the same night, Fedor fought Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Kosaka would throw a right hand that would miss, but this caused his elbow to hit Fedor on the same spot he received a cut in his previous match against Ricardo. The fight was stopped by the doctor 17 seconds into the fight, which also handed Fedor his first career loss. Following this fight, Fedor would earn a win against Mikhail Apostolov when he submitted him via rear naked choke early into the first round. His next 5 fights were part of the Ring's openweight title tournament. In the first round, he beat Kerry Shaw by armbar. In round 2, Fedor fought Anato Babalu Sobral. The fight was fairly close, with both men being able to secure takedowns and attempt submissions. In ring, strikes to the head were not allowed on ground opponents, which led to strikes being landed to the body instead. On the same night, Fedor was to fight Bobby Hoffman for the heavyweight championship, but Bobby refused by saying he had a shoulder injury and was unable to fight. Fedor was automatically given the Ring's championship belt. After his decision win against Babalu, Fedor would fight Ryushi Yanagisawa. The same thing would happen in this fight. Fedor would take down Ryushi, attempt submissions, and maintain dominant position, which gave him the unanimous decision victory. In the semifinals, he fought Lee Hasdale. In this fight, Fedor landed a casting hook, which helped him secure the takedown. I have to say that most of these fights would have ended much earlier if Fedor was allowed to strike to the head when on the ground. But regardless, he was still able to lock in the guillotine choke. In the finals of the tournament, Fedor would fight Chris Haseman. He would win the fight in the first on the feet after a right hand dropped Chris that forced the ref to stop the fight. Fedor won the tournament and afterwards would join Pride, which was another Japanese fighting promotion which allowed ground strikes to the head and even soccer kicks. And Fedor took advantage of that in his debut against Semi Schilt. Fedor would go for the takedown and throw heavy strikes from above to earn the unanimous decision win. Following this fight, Fedor fought Heath Herring, who was the favorite going into the fight. But the narrative would change when Fedor would take the fight to the ground at ease and use his ground and pound to destroy the face of Herring. The entire round was a beatdown, and when it finally ended, the doctor called a stop to the fight. This made Fedor the #1 contender to fight for the heavyweight championship against champion Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Although Nogueira was the favorite, Fedor impressed by dominating the fight. After landing a right hand that rocked Nogueira, Fedor would continue to apply pressure from the top by throwing some of the nastiest ground and pound I've ever seen. Nogueira would attempt submissions off his back but was unsuccessful. When the fight was on the feet, Nogueira would attempt takedowns, but they would either get stuffed or reversed by Fedor. By the time the final bell rung, it was obvious that Fedor was the victor. That night, Fedor became the Pride heavyweight champion. His first fight following this win was back with rings against Egidijus Valavikas. Since the promotion did not allow strikes to the head on a grounded opponent, it really showed how big of a component the ground and pound was in Fedor's game. After controlling the fight for the first round, Fedor would finish it in the second with a Kimura. Back in Pride, Fedor fought Kazuyuki Fujita, and where Fedor was a huge favorite. Even the announcers were saying Fujita's only hope was taking Fedor down, as he didn't have much finishing power on the feet. But Fujita was able to land a right hand to the temple that stunned Fedor, and it was the most trouble we ever saw Fedor in at that point. The fight was taken to the ground, but Fedor was able to survive, and even though he was able to get back up, he was still very wobbly on his feet. But that's all the opportunity he needed, because Fedor landed a liver kick and a 1-2 that dropped Fujita. Fedor immediately secured the rear naked choke. It was impressive considering how much adversity Fedor was able to overcome before getting the finish. Fedor's next fight was against Gary Goodridge, and it was a one-sided beatdown that had Fedor throw heavy strikes from the beginning. He was able to secure the takedown and continue with punches and kicks from above. This was in Pride, where kicking on a grounded opponent was legal, and it looked even more brutal with the power that Fedor had behind them. Following this win, Fedor fought Yugi Nagada at the event Bombay 2003, and he did this to earn a higher purse due to the fight being on New Year's Eve, and it was competing with a K1 kickboxing card. The fight was another dominant showing from Fedor, who knocked down Nagada multiple times before finishing him off on the ground. Fedor went back to Pride to fight former UFC heavyweight champion Mark Coleman. Early in the fight, Mark was able to secure top position and quickly took Fedor's back and attempted a rear naked choke. And even though Fedor got out and attempted a guillotine, he was taken down again. But while on his back, Fedor secured the armbar and forced Coleman to tap. Fedor's next opponent was Kevin Randleman. The former UFC heavyweight champ was just coming off an upset of the year knockout of Mirko Cro Cop. And the momentum continued against Fedor when Randleman took him down early. What was even more troubling was when Fedor got back up, but Randleman suplexed Fedor back to the ground and Fedor landed on his neck. But he was okay, and from there, Fedor was able to work into side control where he locked in the Kimura. On August 15, 2004, Fedor fought twice in the same evening in the Pride Grand Prix. His first fight was against Naoya Ogawa. The fight was really quick after Fedor rushed in with strikes that forced Ogawa to go in for the takedown. Fedor would get into the mount and secure an armbar submission. In the finals, Fedor once again fought Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. I just want to say to anyone who has never seen a Fedor walkout, watch the one he had for this fight because it was absolutely bone-chilling. In a good way, of course. The fight was contested mostly on the ground, with Fedor controlling the top position. Fedor would continue to throw punches from the top until his head collided with Nogueira's. This caused a deep cut on Fedor's head, which eventually caused doctors to stop the fight. The result was a no contest due to an accidental headbutt. It was an unfortunate end to the fight, but Pride would set up the rubber match and the two fought again 4 months later. In this fight, Fedor kept it on the feet and was able to pick his shots while defending takedowns from Nogueira. When Fedor took the top position, he would effectively land shots and avoid Nogueira's submission attempts. Fedor continued the damage in the stand-up throughout the entire fight, and this would earn him the unanimous decision victory. Fedor's next fight was against the first man to defeat him, Tsuyoshi Kosaka. But this time, Fedor was able to control the fight by using his pressure and picking his shots. The fight ended with a nice combo that dropped Kosaka, allowing Fedor to avenge his only loss. His next fight was against Mirko Cro Cop, and this was a fight a long time in the making, as Cro Cop was considered to be one of the best heavyweights in the world at that point. And going into the Fedor fight, Cro Cop was on a 7-fight win streak, with 6 of those wins ending in under 4 minutes. Both men were able to connect with their strikes. Mirko was successful in landing his powerful kicks, where he kicked Fedor in the midsection and landed a few liver shots. But Fedor was able to take the fight to the ground multiple times where he had the advantage. And after 3 rounds, Fedor won the unanimous decision and retained his championship belt. Fedor's next fight was against Zulu Zino, who he knocked down really quickly and would eventually have the fight stopped by the ref after raining down some hard punches from the top. Fedor moved on to fight Mark Coleman again, and this fight was very similar to the first. Mark would attempt a couple of takedowns but was unsuccessful. This would give Fedor the opportunity to connect with punches on the feet, and the fight quickly started to become a beatdown. Mark Coleman was desperately trying to secure a takedown throughout the fight, and when he finally did, Fedor locked in the armbar and Coleman was forced to tap. I want to take this moment to give light to Fedor. Inside the cage, he was a terrifying destroyer, but outside of it, he was kind and humble. And he proved that in this post-fight interview with Coleman, who was trying to console his young daughters who were terrified to what they just saw. But Fedor was a sport about it and was really friendly towards Mark and his daughters. And even if he did knock out someone in spectacular fashion, he wouldn't celebrate like most people would. He would remain calm, and if his opponent was badly out, he would make sure they're okay. Anyways, Fedor went on to fight Mark Conta at the end of 2006. Mark Hunt was able to escape an armbar attempt and even take down Fedor himself. Fedor almost got locked by an Americana, but was able to slip out and get back on his feet. From there, Fedor took the fight to the ground himself and secured a Kimura lock, which Mark Hunt would tap to. This fight also ended up being Fedor's last fight with Pride before it was bought out by the UFC. But negotiations between the UFC and Fedor's management team, M1 Global, became the main barrier from Fedor fighting for the promotion. Fedor would fight Matt Lindland in Russia on a Bodog fight event. Matt was able to open a cut above Fedor's left eye. Regardless, Fedor was able to hip throw Lindland onto the mat. After making his way to the mount, Fedor secured the armbar that forced Lindland to tap. Fedor would then fight Hongman Choi in Japan. This was one of Fedor's most famous fights because he was much smaller than the 7'2" Choi. Fedor would attempt a takedown but was immediately taken down himself due to the size of Choi. But on the bottom, he would attempt an armbar, but Choi was able to get out. Fedor attempted a takedown that left him on his back, and he would then again go for the armbar. But this time he locked it tight, and this forced Hongman Choi to tap. After this fight, Fedor signed with US MMA promotion Affliction, where he made his debut against former UFC heavyweight champion Tim Sylvia. This was a huge moment for Fedor as it was the first time he would be fighting in a US fighting promotion. And this translated to tougher competition, and he had that in Tim Sylvia, who was the number 4 heavyweight in the world at that point. The fight ended quick after Fedor lit him up with strikes before finishing him on the ground with a rear naked choke. This win earned him the WAMA heavyweight championship. After this fight, Fedor fought former UFC heavyweight champion Andrei Arlovski. In the first 3 minutes of the fight, Arlovski was fast with his attacks and was effectively landing his shots. The momentum was definitely shining towards Andrei's side, but when Andrei attempted a flying knee, Fedor landed a right hand that knocked Arlovski out cold. Following this title defense, Affliction folded as a company. And even though there was much discussion from UFC president Dana White on signing Fedor and getting him to the UFC to fight champion Brock Lesnar, the two sides were unable to make a deal. So Fedor ended up signing with Strikeforce and made his debut in November of 2009 against the undefeated Brett Rogers. In the first round, Fedor was able to take Brett down and land some shots, but Brett reversed Fedor after a Kimura attempt. From there, Rogers landed some heavy blows from the top before Fedor attempted an armbar. But in the second round, Fedor landed a beautiful right hand that dropped Brett. Fedor finished the fight on the top by strikes before the ref pulled him off. After this fight, Fedor went on to fight Fabricio Werdum. Fedor was considered the favorite going into this fight, as he was for most of his fights. And the fight itself was trending that way as Fedor landed a combo that dropped Werdum early. He would rush in to try to finish Fabricio on the ground, and as he did, Werdum would attempt to lock up his arm, but Fedor pushed through and continued raining on punches. But Werdum swung his legs up again and this time locked up the triangle choke that forced Fedor to tap. In the post-fight interview, Fedor was apologetic for losing and thanks God for whatever happens. It was Fedor's first defeat in 10 years, making this one of the biggest upsets in MMA. People viewed this loss either as a fluke, poor decision making by Fedor, or not being able to be a top fighter in a US fighting promotion. Following this loss, Fedor fought Antonio Bigfoot Silva in the quarterfinals of the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. The fight started with Fedor being the aggressor and rushing in swinging wildly, but as he came close, Bigfoot was able to counter effectively. At one point, Fedor almost secured a guillotine choke and a Kimura, but Bigfoot was able to survive and Fedor looked tired. Silva would take the opportunity to start being the aggressor by answering with strikes of his own. In the second round, Silva immediately took down Fedor and put an absolute beating on him. Bigfoot was striking from the top and this led him to a rear naked choke attempt. But even when Fedor escaped, Silva took the mount and started raining hammer fists on his face. This continued until the end of the round. Fedor's eye was busted shut and this forced the doctor to stop the fight. This was Fedor's second loss in a row, and in the post-fight interview, he said maybe it was time to retire. Fedor questioned retirement before due to injuries and aging, but he came back in July of 2011 to fight former Pride welterweight and middleweight champion Dan Henderson, who was also the promotion's light heavyweight champion at that point. Fedor started pressuring early and was able to land with strikes, but Henderson retaliated and was also able to connect. With a minute remaining in the round, Fedor landed an overhand right that hurt Dan. Fedor attempted to finish the fight with heavy ground and pound, but Henderson was able to reverse Fedor and throw a right hand that landed on his chin. Henderson continued to throw strikes until Herb Dean stopped the fight. It was the first TKO loss of Fedor's career. Some say that the fight was stopped early or that the final shots Dan landed were to the back of Fedor's head. Regardless, Fedor would later say that the 3 losses were due to changes in his family that affected him and mistakes in his preparations, but he truly believed he could have won those 3 fights. Now after these fights in Strikeforce, Fedor went back to Russia and Japan to pick up wins against Jeff Monson, Satoshi Ishii, and Pedro Hizo. Following the fight with Pedro Hizo, Fedor would announce his retirement from the sport. But 3 years later, in 2015, Fedor came back to fight Singh Jaydeep, who he would beat in the first round by punches. Fedor then won a controversial fight against Fabio Maldonado, and where many people believed the fight to be a draw, yet Fedor won the unanimous decision. Fedor was in discussions with signing with the UFC again, but instead signed with Bellator and made his debut against Matt Mitrione, who knocked him out 1 minute and 14 seconds into the first round. Fedor entered the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix and made it to the finals after knocking out Frank Mir and Chael Sonnen in the first and second round respectively. But Fedor would lose in the finals to Ryan Bader by knockout, 35 seconds into the first round. Fedor's most recent win was a TKO win against Rampage Jackson back in 2019. I believe he'll probably fight again, but at this point, Fedor is no longer in the prime of his career. And that's okay because fighters get older and simply aren't the same as they used to be. And after a long career being at the top of a heavyweight division that was filled with absolute killers, it was bound to happen to Fedor as well. So at this point, considering everything that has happened, how good was Fedor Emelianenko actually? Now I know I said Cain Velasquez was the greatest of all time, and some of you corrected me that I could say he was the best but not the greatest due to his resume. And I agree with that, and therefore I would say Fedor was the greatest heavyweight of all time. And I know there's also Stipe Miocic in the conversation, as he's the current holder for the most title defenses in UFC heavyweight history. But going undefeated for 10 years as a heavyweight is a whole nother level of greatness. And I get it, maybe the level of competition wasn't the greatest at times, but he still beat some of the greatest legends in the sport in Minotauro Nogueira, Miracle Cro Cop, Mark Hunt, Tim Sylvia, and the list is long enough for me to confidently give this title to Fedor. And if you haven't seen some of these fights, I recommend you do because I truly believe he was ahead of his time. Fedor was an all-around fighter who had the perfect mix in power, speed, and skill. His sambo and judo was unlike any that we've seen at heavyweight, and when that was mixed with his superhuman strength, he was able to take down his opponents at will. Fedor was incredibly fast for a heavyweight, and that would lead to constant pressuring that made his opponents crumble. His ground game was also spectacular as he had one of the most vicious ground and pounds and wasn't ever afraid to attempt a submission. On top of all of that, he's a very humble person, and you wouldn't expect that from a man who was an absolute destroyer. So yes, Fedor Emelianenko was very good, but more importantly, he was legendary. My name is Kiiyon, and this was my take on how good Fedor Emelianenko actually was. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put it in the comments down below because I'd love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But that's all I have for now, so I'll see you in my next one.